recording. So today I just want to kind of talk about where to start on a rendering. I tend to get intense writer's block, and so I'll show you just like how I kind of get the ball rolling. But then also, as you get that ball rolling, like what are some things you might want to consider early on into your rendering in order to make sure that you're working efficiently and kind of, I guess, yeah, mostly efficiently. So we're just going to talk about how to start where you want to end, how to create a vision, and just some considerations of depth of field and composition. And this is all in no particular order. Start where you want to end is a lot like crap in, crap out, something I've kind of been trying to repeat throughout this term. And the idea is that you want to start where you want to end. You want to, start with the highest quality source images that you have, so that when you're done with your rendering, then you have the highest quality source images making your rendering, therefore making it at a higher quality. Or we're writing kind of simple sentences about what we're intending our project to be. And that message that we're writing in those sentences, hopefully, will follow us to the end where we have kind of completed that, that storytelling throughout our rendering. But there's a few other ways that this kind of saying could be used in our workflows, in our work. And I think it's a great mantra to use while creating a lot of graphic design stuff. So I think in a practice of starting where you want to end, like I said earlier, you want to try to like write out a theme, identify certain messages, and look for a precedence or two for a particular rendering when you start it. Oftentimes when people are talking about practicing music, they talk about playing the greats in order to become great themselves. And that stays true in rendering. Find precedents that you really want to have your work look like, and use different entourage, use different landscapes, but you can keep that skeleton, and it can really come into favor in the end of your rendering. And sorry, my puppy's losing his mind a little bit. And then also in part of this, I think in a way, just to make sure that visually we're starting where we want to end, we want to make a couple quick sketches. Yes, we can, once he's settled down a little bit. Okay. So what is a sketch? I was always self-conscious about my sketches. I'm going to close my door really quick. Okay, so I was always very self-conscious about my sketches. I did take a couple art classes, but they never followed through. But that was until I started actually kind of peeling back other designers' work and being able to kind of see where their projects start. And so I'm just going to show you a couple of my sketches and kind of show you where they ended, just to kind of help uncover that workflow a little bit. And I think in addition to that, this is something that's kind of held true throughout my work here too, is that we're making sketches for landscapes that are worth or end up becoming landscapes of multiple, like thousands, tens of thousands of dollars. And they're just a quick sketch on a piece of paper that don't look much better than these sketches, which kind of blew my mind when I first saw that. So I pointed out that video about like this old poster vintage aesthetic, like how to on that website. I used that to make this diagram on the right. Here you can see I was starting to get a little bit into that composition, kind of how I imagined my diagram to look. And I'll usually write just a quick note just to help if my sketch isn't clear enough, just to help myself remind what my idea was. And so these aren't great, but they're good enough to kind of get the idea and to start to build something in Photoshop. So the sketches, they can be quick and dirty, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, they should be just like a fast, just get it on the page, and then either develop it further somewhere else, or just set it aside for a little while. The important part is that you can get the idea across. Of course, this sketch is probably the most effective getting the idea across to myself later in time. And I might want to reiterate it or give another iteration if I wanted to share it in a presentation or something. But this is just a great way of kind of giving yourself a head start when you're working on a rendering or a project. In the theme of starting where you want to end, it's also really important to understand what shape is my rendering going to take. Is it in the bottom corner of my page where I don't actually have a lot of space to explore whatever information I'm trying to explore? Or am I giving it a super wide like aspect ratio because it's a landscape rendering, and landscape rendering should be in landscape. They should be wide and expansive. So when you start your Photoshop rendering, right away creating your artboard at the ratio that you'll probably export it at and keep it at in its final form is a great way to make yourself more efficient and help build that like composition right away. And so you want to kind of, when you're like making your posters, for example, have an idea of where is this rendering going? How much space do I have for it? And what shape is it going to end up having to take? And once you kind of have an idea of the ratio, the canvas shape that you might be working within, you don't want to start too far ahead, but you can start considering maybe some of the composition of your rendering. Like, for example, if you are going to have this kind of foreground frame idea, but maybe applied to the landscape, and maybe you're looking through some bushes and trees at your rendering, maybe you don't actually have to work on the landscape of the rendering on the outer edges, and you can save yourself some time in having to make things that are hidden perfect. And so I think it's important just to kind of start to imagine, and precedents really help with this. Like, what is going to be in the background, the midground, and the foreground? What is the most important part, the subject of my rendering, and what maybe might be in the background, and I don't have to, work as hard on it because it's not as noticeable. So, when I make a lot of my renderings, I don't really apply very complicated compositions to them. Oftentimes I find that especially for like my past master's project, which you'll see a lot of just because that was the latest time I was able to use all of my skills and create a large amount of work. Most of that work was in kind of the rules of three composition. And so you can see that I have the foreground, the midground, and the background, and they're almost in perfect thirds, taking up the space of that object. Because master projects are loaded with information, all my renderings were squares and off to the right side so that I could have information on the left side as I presented. Real quick, looking at the rendering on the right, how do you imagine that I made that rendering? You can type it out if you don't want to speak.
It looks like some layers in Photoshop like superimposed on top of each other.
Yeah, and yeah, I did this in similar way as we did the soil layers, but one little twist that I think is just an important tool to kind of know it exists is using the 3D topography on Google Earth. And that allowed me to get these mountains a little bit more three-dimensional. And so the water is from its own image, and then all these different layers here are actually from Google Earth. And then can anyone identify what I did to the background to create a little bit of a sense of depth?
Did you lower the opacity?
Yeah, and yeah, and a little bit of desaturation. And the hope was to give a little bit of what they call an atmospheric perspective. So like when you're hiked to the top of Spencer's Butte and you look out in the distance, things that are further away, there's more moisture in the air, more clouds in the way, and they kind of distort, desaturate, and kind of lower the visibility of things far away. And that's a great way of just starting to create some depth. And so you'll notice I often will do that kind of effect just to help really solidify what is in the background visually. And field of view. So I had this idea of wanting to explore a chipmunk running on a log using logs as kind of modes of quick transportation through the forests. And to me, because the chipmunk is so small and its world is so small, creating this really intense kind of macro lens aesthetic was important. I wouldn't do this if it was for a landscape rendering or perspective. But knowing that you're able to take a chipmunk whose depth is already established and start to manipulate that to fit more into your photo is really good to know you can do in Photoshop. And there's just so many rules for composition. I think it's really easy to get bogged down. And that's one reason maybe precedence is a great way to start, and exploring the composition of a already finished precedent or rendering. But if you're really into it, you can right away assign sort of certain composition rules and try to play them through and see how they end up. I find often in landscape architecture, they end up kind of being the second thought and start to become something you adjust later down the road, but under kind of keeping them in mind in the beginning and working with them in the beginning can be really beneficial to your overall body of work. So I just wanted to show this kind of grouping of renderings and just show kind of how in my master's project, how simple I kept the composition. It did break free a few times, but you can really see that I just held true to the rule of thirds. And the most important thing is often perfectly in the center and in kind of the mid to foreground. It's kind of hard to tell. And then I used a lot of repetition just to try to help show folks or kind of give a timeline of events. But that's something we can get into later. All to say, the composition doesn't have to be very complicated or intense. Okay, so this slide here is just to kind of reset everything and kind of make us consider good ways to start when we're kind of at a blank page. So I've kind of, in my work, have started blank pages in 3 different ways. And so I'll show you those 3 different ways, at least the outcomes of those 3 different ways. And we can kind of see the strengths and weaknesses of those as we go. First of all, I think it's important for me just to show that I often start my work from the background and move forward from midground to foreground. I don't know if that is a best practice, but for me, that's a quick and easy way of immediately understanding the perspective of my image, figuring out scale and placement of objects within my image. And so as I scroll through all my work, I'll see the same background images pop up over and over and over again. And so that's a nice way for me to kind of get over that blank page, because as soon as I throw that background image into my blank canvas, suddenly I have a full canvas to work with, and I have a lot of things that I can start picking away at and start to interact with. But sometimes you're not so lucky to be able to find a site that is perfect for your renderings. And that's when you can create them via Rhino, or we used Twinmotion. I know some people use Enscape, I think. And I feel really strongly that it's important to add layers of kind of real life into those renderings to help kind of remove them from that kind of weird computer video game aesthetic. And I'm not sure I totally did that successfully here. I started adding extra textures, added some entourage to help kind of break up this really hyper clean computerized looking rendering. But I think I could have definitely done more with the textures. And here's another example. So the things that are really hard to render, I went ahead and found source images like the fort, and I think parts of the rock as well, to bring in to kind of help me break up that clean aesthetic, and also help kind of give me a head start when I'm trying to break out of Twinmotion. And the same goes with the entourage. So I think a lot of the folks in studio are going to be kind of working through a workflow similar to this, where you're working on your objects, topography, or any sort of 3D elements in Rhino, and then you'll be exporting them and applying textures and images to them. And so that's a great way to kind of break free of that blank page and start with something to really start working on. So I think some of these trees were in the rendering software, but then I went ahead and I beat them up in Photoshop using some of the stamp tools that we've talked about, and shading and things like that. So the strengths I think of this is that right away you get to have full control of the perspectives that you create. And you have a lot more time to like really be make the different objects or elements your own in the 3D modeling. But it's really hard to separate that rendering from the kind of fake feeling that a lot of computerized graphics have. That kind of breaks that um, kind of touch of humanity of some sort. And if you really want to challenge, you can recreate your entire landscape. Um, I tend not to do this very often because of my blank page issue. But all of these elements here are separate from themselves. I made this, I think, during my media class, and the foreground is a different image from the midground, is a different image from the background. And you can see I was extremely challenged in finding the right perspective, in blending some things, and when it came down to like getting the repetition out of the way, I didn't have the capacity, energy, or time to kind of shoot for removing those kind of little problems for the eyes. But it is possible. And I think that's where having a good sketch to start with is really helpful. And I think it's really important to be easy on yourself and understand it is okay to restart, it is okay to get stuck, and it's okay to change your mind. I've done that a multitude of times. This is sort of an exploration of all the different times I try to make a rendering of wood getting kind of stuck in the river. And that's 5 different times. And I think you can see that at one point I got really desperate. I went totally off script. I got stuck. I restarted. I tried again. It's totally okay. And that happens. Just be patient with yourself. And then this is also a great point just to say, like, when we're submitting assignments that we're working on for this class, things like having this heron only partially cut out is totally okay. Just by seeing that, I kind of understand your intentions, and I'd rather see a heron crudely cut out than no heron at all. And that is hopefully some tips on how to get started on a rendering. Are there any questions at all?